Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. Just over 2 years after the Islamic State group blitzed across Iraq, seizing control of about a third of the country, are the days of the self-proclaimed caliphate numbered? Well, following recent offenses in Ramadi and Fallujah and Tikrit, the Iraqi army, with crucial air power backing by the U.S.-led coalition, is now setting its sights on its biggest battle yet. And that is the campaign to recapture Mosul. Now, the fall of Iraq's second largest city, and the largest city anywhere that's still under Islamic State group control, would mark a stunning setback for the jihadist group. But the campaign promises to be long, bloody, and arduous. Well, my guest today is Peter Harling. He's a Middle East specialist. He's been on our show before. He's lived 7 years in Iraq. He recently returned from a visit to the country. And he says that while, yes, Iraqis generally do want to see the Islamic State group defeated, driven from the country, they're also wary of the chaos that might all of a sudden arise in the country once they're gone. Peter Harling, thanks for joining us. You're in Beirut today. I want to go right to something you wrote recently in Le Monde Diplomatique, weekly newspaper here. You said that Iraq's social order relies to a certain extent on what you call on the business of conflict, which suggests in a sense that for some Iraqis, perverse as it may sound, it's in their interest perhaps for the jihadists to remain in it. Am I totally, correct me if I'm wrong, but am I totally off base?
Well, I think virtually everyone in Iraq genuinely, sincerely wants the defeat of the Islamic State. But at that time, indeed, a number of officials in particular, but also armed factions within the country, do have an interest in using the struggle against the Islamic State to distract from a number of other realities. The Islamic State didn't surge in Iraq and take over whole swaths of the country if it weren't for the weakness of the system and the appalling the appalling performance of the political class over now 13 years since the regime was toppled back in 2003 in terms of governance, representative politics, building institutions, and so on.
How much, can you give us an idea of how much sympathy among the local populations, especially where it has control, does ISIS garner in Iraq versus the government, who people universally scorn and condemn?
Well, I don't think the Islamic State really offers today an appealing model for anyone. It's an effective model. They've been quite good at conquering territory, at entrenching themselves, at putting out an image of themselves through rather savvy propaganda. But in terms of the realities on the ground, they don't have much on offer. The Islamic State cannot implement a credible form of governance in the areas it controls. Now, the problem is that those who are subjected to the Islamic State were subjected prior to it to other very dysfunctional, predatory forms of governance. They've been adapting to that for years, be it the former regime or some of the power players that have been imposing themselves since it was toppled by the U.S. in 2003. So in practice, people simply have to make do with whatever's on offer. And here the problem is that we're in a headlong rush to defeat the Islamic State, to have some symbolic victories before the end of the year, especially given the U.S. presidential agenda, the need for Obama to have some kind of legacy issue in the Middle East, right? So in a headlong rush to score points, but with no long-term vision.
So it's in the interest, you're suggesting, both the U.S. administration and of the Iraqi prime minister, who perhaps I could assume part of this whole campaign is about him being able to gain some legitimacy and to conserve his power. There's sort of there's mutual interests here.
Well, indeed, and he's in a very difficult spot and probably doing his best, but you have structural problems that are not being addressed. If you look at the military dynamics, you have three sets of players. You have the U.S. and the coalition, which is providing essentially air support, but also training on the ground and forms of coordination, which are entirely lacking within the Iraqi military landscape. You have some components of the Iraqi military, namely special forces that have been trained, equipped, are to some extent informally commanded by the U.S. And you have all kinds of militias which loosely tie into this effort, are mostly uncoordinated among themselves, but are also indispensable because although they're not necessarily very competent or the best equipped forces in the field, they are extremely motivated and necessary in that sense.
Peter, you were in Iraq in the early years of the U.S. occupation, and you'll remember, the storming into the country of the U.S. Army. They stormed in, they conquered pretty quickly. They had no post-occupation plan for reconstruction. It seems, are the Iraqis in a similar situation today, freeing up these towns from the jihadists, but not really knowing what to do afterwards or even how to hold those areas?
Well, I think we're facing a pattern in a conflict that has become cyclical, right? When the U.S. toppled the regime in 2003, there was no plan for the day after. We know that. That's established. But we've seen any number of battles ever since, over 13 years, in which ground was retaken with no plan for the day after. You could think of Fallujah, which has been retaken any number of times. I've stopped counting. It was retaken in 2003, in 2004, in 2007-8. It's been retaken recently. And every time jihadi movements or other dissident forces have made a comeback. So if you look at U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine, one expression that was coined in the context of Iraq was clear, hold, and build.
And build.
You clear the enemy out, you hold your ground, and then you rebuild a functioning, sustainable system.
Well, we haven't seen the rebuilding, that's fair to say.
The opponents have long adapted to this and developed their own strategy or doctrine, if you will, which you could sum up as recoil, redeploy, and spoil. Right? So we can go through any number of such cycles, and the U.S., which never really wanted to assume responsibility for taking over Iraq, has been looking for expedient ways of getting rid of that responsibility for 13 years now, which is ironic in itself, just kicking the can down the road endlessly. And it's sad to see that the Obama administration, which wanted to close this file and move on, is, as its predecessor, just using expedients and handing the whole file over to the next.
You were mentioning just before Fallujah and how it was, freed, retaken, resettled by jihadists on several different occasions. Where do the jihadist groups go when these cities are liberated? Physically, where do they disappear to? And let's presume that Mosul is recaptured at some point after a long and brutal campaign. Where are they going to go? And do they hide out in Iraq? Do they cross the borders and leave and come back?
Well, we have an interesting precedent, which is that the jihadi movement, as it developed in spectacular ways in the early stages of the U.S. occupation, peaking around 2006, 2007, had essentially retreated into desert land. You had small groups of individuals almost living in caves, or living in hiding, right? And that was enough of a kernel to enable the Islamic State to surge in 2014. So it gives you a sense of how this notion of redeploying and bouncing back can be effective. In today's context, we could imagine the Islamic State redeploying to Syria, of course, neighboring Syria, to finding places where it could hide in Iraq, or stepping up its strategy of taking the fight to Western states and other parts of the region, parts of Africa. I think there's no limit to the kind of pockets where they can find a constituency, which initially at least might be enthusiastic and enough to take hold.
And we're obviously seeing them looking for other pockets, a battle being fought in Libya as well right now. Much is being made of if, in fact, they lose this self-proclaimed caliphate, if they lose the physical territory that they've held, they will lose their appeal and their ability to recruit. Do you believe that, or could they remain potent even if they lose the land on the ground?
Well, I think it's very naive to assume that the Islamic State has been doing well, mostly because people don't understand what it really is and what it really means, and that we need to explain to them that it's all wrong, it's different from what they think. People choose to believe for structural reasons. I don't think the whole idea of countering narratives is very relevant if you take the context of the US presidential debates. It doesn't really matter what one of the candidates is saying. In a sense, he's saying very much like Clinton said during his own campaign, it's the economy stupid. You today have a candidate which is saying it's the emotion stupid. That's what counts. And I think we're in a world today of confusion, of anxiety, where everything is changing in ways which are extremely destabilizing. And that's what something like the Islamic State can benefit from and build on. And if you look at their propaganda and take it seriously, that's exactly what they're going after.
Peter Harling, we're going to have to leave it on, I guess, a slightly grim note there. But the Islamic State basically based a lot on emotion and making that comparison to a lot of what we're seeing in the U.S. presidential election. Thank you very much once again. Remind our viewers, specialist on the Middle East, but more importantly, you've lived many years in Iraq.